What's the most historical use of deception that worked? Rosa Parks was not a simple seamstress whose lowly act of defiance in 1955 sparked the civil rights movement. In fact, she was a trained Communist Party, CPUSA, activist. Her refusal to move to the back of the bus wasn't a spontaneous gesture, but a provocation organized by her longtime employer, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. This treatment illustrates how the American political leaders and mass media routinely deceive and betray the public. The New York Times obituary said her arrest turned a very private woman into a reluctant symbol and torchbearer. Consensus is that the ends justify the means in this deception, but it was most certainly a very historically significant use of deception that worked to alter public perception and affect major political change. Victor Lustig and the Eiffel Tower. In 1928, conman Victor Lustig posed as a French government official, and invited the most successful scrap metal business owners to a lavish Paris hotel. Once they had all arrived, he proposed to them an exclusive and confidential business opportunity. The Eiffel Tower was for sale. At that point in time, the Eiffel Tower was not viewed as the same landmark that it is today. It was seen as unattractive to many, and the maintenance was an annoyance to the city. Lustig went through a well-planned presentation and handed out spec sheets that gave off a legitimate feel. They even took a tour of the site. Afterwards, he told them when and where they could present their bids. Days later, the winning bidder was at the hotel meeting with Lustig, deposit check in hand. When he started to become a little weary, Lustig in turn pulled out his acting skills and began complaining about his job and salary, and basically solicited a bribe. The buyer was quickly reassured because all of the government officials he had met and done business with before had done the same thing to him. He handed over his $1 million check, received an ownership certificate, and never saw Lustig again. The man was so embarrassed he supposedly never told anyone. Lustig came back some years later and did the whole thing again for a second time. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the best-selling book of the 19th century, written by a lady from Connecticut, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who read the memoirs of a former slave and wrote an abolitionist propaganda piece having never visited the South, helped fuel Northern support for abolition. There is an anecdotal piece about Lincoln meeting her and saying something like, "So this is the little lady who started the war," but that isn't its lasting legacy. It created many black stereotypes still in play today. Some even retain their names directly from the book. The lazy and carefree young black man, Sam; a light-skinned, or mixed black woman, a sex object, Eliza, Cassie, and Emmeline. The large and dark-skinned Mammy, the pickaninny, imagery of black children, Topsy. And finally, of course, Uncle Tom himself, an African-American who is eager to please whites. When First Lady Edith Wilson secretly ran the United States government in the aftermath of her husband, President Woodrow Wilson, suffering a severe stroke. In the aftermath of America's participation in what was then the world's worst war, World War I, and his diplomatic wrangling at the Paris Peace Conference that followed the war's conclusion in 1919, a worn-out President Wilson returned to America only to experience a series of medical crises. First, he endured a bout of influenza early in the year. Second, on September 25th, he actually collapsed on a public speaking tour, while trying to garner support for his proposed League of Nations. The worst incident, however, occurred on October 2nd, 1919. On that date, Wilson suffered a stroke of such intensity that it incapacitated him, having permanently paralyzed the left side of his body and even blinding his left eye, while he was bedridden for the next 2 months. Only his wife, physicians, and a few other close associates saw him. In the meantime, the First Lady in effect took over many of the president's responsibilities, including reviewing various important matters of state. Even after the president was released from his sickbed, he still spent the remainder of the year in a wheelchair. As 1920 came about, his mental health had clearly deteriorated as his mind wandered and he exhibited a diminished memory. Thus, the First Lady continued to play a pivotal role as a sort of unofficial acting president. As the First Lady put it, she had taken on the stewardship to care for the largely incapacitated president and keep the American government running as smoothly as possible. The situation was so unique in American history and the president's condition so tragic, that the extent of what the ailing president endured was kept secret from the American public until his death a couple of years after his term ended. Columbus and the 1504 eclipse. On his fourth voyage, Columbus found himself stranded in Jamaica. The locals were initially cooperative, but after a year or so got sick of Columbus' cruisebaggery, and basically wanted them gone. Columbus had a star almanac with him and noticed a lunar eclipse coming up, so he called the natives together and told them that his god was mad. They had started to become so inhospitable, and was going to take the moon out of the sky. Sure enough, when night came, the moon slowly turned red and everyone begged Chris to make it stop. He said he had to go pray about the whole thing, and locked himself in his cabin with an hourglass waiting until he knew the moon would be coming out of the shadow, came out and basically said, "Okay, God says he'll bring the moon back if you start supplying us again," which they did. During the invasion of Iraq, coalition forces recorded a day's worth of radio chatter, and played it along the border we weren't attacking, thus fooling Iraqi forces into thinking we were attacking on their flank. During the Second Boer War, in South Africa, British Colonel Baden-Powell deceived the much larger Boer force into believing his smaller defensive force was much better supplied than it was. He did things like filling dozens of boxes with sand, and one with TNT. He ordered his men to bury them around the perimeter and then exploded the one with TNT, making the Boers believe he had created a minefield. That was all his TNT. He also didn't have any barbed wire, but he noticed that he could see the wire posts in the enemy line, but not the wire itself, so he had men pretend to lay barbed wire, and then pretend they were navigating it when crossing the line. They successfully held out for 217 days, completely cut off from supply lines. Maybe I missed it, but I'm partial to Gen H. Norman Schwarzkopf dissection of the Iraqi military during Operation Desert Storm. Essentially, the US intelligence community had reason to believe top Iraqi leadership watched CNN and took it as gospel. The US set up a large amphibious landing demonstration which they let the press attend. Iraqi leadership saw this as CNN presented. They understood this as a rehearsal for the coalition's plan to cement the thought process. The US dropped leaflets depicting death from the sea. Saddam then reorganized his troops along the coast for the inevitable attack. This allowed for the left hook from Saudi Arabia, causing the destruction of the third biggest military in the world in a matter of days. Also, Iraqi freedom played off of Desert Storm in that people thought they would do the same kind of attack in 2003. Instead, the US opted for a blitzkrieg-like plan. Not the biggest, but one of the more interesting. In Poland, during World War II, two doctors accidentally discovered a way to create a false positive in the test for typhus. The Nazis were terrified of typhus. There had been massive outbreaks in camps that had started spreading to German soldiers, but the doctors knew it was rare for Nazis to kill Poles with typhus, and once a Pole was confirmed with typhus, they could never be taken to a concentration camp, regardless of whether they recovered. So, the doctors injected thousands of people in their town with this experimental solution that created the false positive for typhus. Over the course of about a year and a half, they successfully tricked the Nazis into thinking the town was undergoing a deadly, sustained typhus epidemic, to the point where all Nazi forces were removed from the town. They're credited with saving over 8,000 lives. Aside from the two doctors, not one person from the town nor a single Nazi knew the outbreak was fake, and in fact not one person had actually died of typhus, or had it at all. The plan worked so well that the Roswitha typhus epidemic stayed on the record books for nearly 20 years before the doctors finally revealed the evidence proving it was fake. Edit, not sure how people keep finding this nearly a month later, but thanks Forensic Cashew for my first ever gold, and thanks new to Reddit Be Nice for finding the only English translated copy of this doctor's book possibly in existence. The internet is kinda cool sometimes. That is an amazing story. I have always been fascinated by the individual stories from World War II. It was so huge and impacted so many people's lives that there is a never-ending series of stories from it. With that out of the way, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want more content to keep appearing in your subscription box. Thanks for watching, and until next time.